Yeah, really pleased to be here, folks. Great to talk to you all. Just a little bit of background about myself. I'm basically started life as a feral child in the Cotswold with a country naturalist upbringing. My dad was a naturalist, Dr. Peter Driver. Wrote about the Eider for any of you ornithologists out there, and I spent all my childhood in roaming the woods and streams and elm-clad hedgerows of those days in the Cotswolds, and also all the holidays we ever had were on Bardsey Island off the coast of North Wales, again steeped in natural history. I was lucky enough to have a career in conservation, coming out of university into initially brief work with wildlife trusts and Nature Conservancy Council, and then was fortunate to become the first conservationist in working on rivers in this country for the Thames Water Authority as their conservation officer for the Thames catchment. Eventually did 20 years of that, and then 15 years of head of conservation nationally for the Environment Agency, and then took early retirement 6 years ago, looking for a new challenge, and boy, have I found it as Director of Rewilding Britain. Really exciting, thoroughly enjoying this role. My day job role is partly traveling the country by invitation, speaking to landowners across the country about rewilding, helping them where appropriate to get on the journey. And it's been a fascinating exercise to see that gradual momentum building. The other part of my role is trying to influence government at as high a level as possible on introducing policies and funding mechanisms that enable landowners and landowning organizations, NGOs, government bodies, private landowners to rewild where appropriate, and recognizing that it is only one piece of a very big jigsaw puzzle. And in fact, last week I was giving evidence to the Parliamentary Committee on Species Reintroductions, which was an interesting experience, and I'll probably say a little bit more about that later. Outside of the day job, I'm also a specialist advisor for a few big sites across the country, and I also manage, I created and manage a nature reserve in my village, a designated local nature reserve, and I do moth trapping and all the sorts of things that I'm sure many of you folks do. So I'm hopefully going to give you an introduction really to rewilding as it stands in this country at this point in time, and give you an overview of where we're up to in terms of who's doing what and what the stats are coming out of these projects. Because one of the things I do is I gather, on behalf of Rewilding Britain, I gather information, data and information from the projects across the country, and that database is growing all the time. But as the title suggests, there's a lot of myths that we need to continually bust about rewilding. And so forgive me if some of you have seen this presentation before, you will have heard some of these messages before, but it's very important that we're all on the same page in conservation. We understand it, where rewilding fits in and where it doesn't. So this is the premise that I will always start with. And I feel I'm entitled to say this because I have got 45 years of professional conservation experience, and I've had the privilege to work on thousands of projects attempting to restore, create habitats. But on its own, this is simply not enough. We know that. We have a fantastic NGO community in this country. We have incredible numbers of people supporting wildlife organizations through their memberships. And we do lots of great things across the country, but it is not enough. We know we're still going backwards. We're going backwards on biodiversity, and we're going backwards on mitigating the impacts of climate change. So we need something else additional, not instead of, additional. And that something else needs to be affordable. We can't, there is simply not the money out there to spend 10 times as much as all of the conservation organizations do at this point in time in this country. There simply isn't the funding out there. We need to find another way of restoring nature at scale, that is affordable and sustainable. And my firm belief is that rewilding gives us that option. Now, I'll just mention also that as I take you through this overview of rewilding, you will see interspersed in it images of projects with information about where they are and the size of the project. I won't have time to talk about the most of the individual projects, but just be aware you will see lots of examples as I go through the presentation. In terms of a definition, this is as short a definition as I can give you. Large-scale restoration of ecosystems to the point where nature is allowed to take care of itself. Two things I need to emphasize here. First of all, what do we mean by large scale? Well, unfortunately, we just don't have the space in this country for the Yellowstones of this world and the Okavangos, etc. So we're not talking very large, actually, especially, let's focusing on England and Wales, which is the area I cover for Rewilding Britain. I'm visiting sites. I'll visit sites of where there is over 250 acres of rewilding potential, say 100 hectares of rewilding potential on block. I believe at that scale, you can move significantly up the rewilding spectrum and deliver the kind of outcomes you might expect. And then there's this point about, where nature is allowed to take care of itself. And this very much relates to the spectrum of activity that rewilding represents. We're on a journey here, and remember the word rewilding is a present participle. Rewilding, when it's an ongoing process. We are moving in a direction. And I always say that when we get to the point where nature is totally taking care of itself at scale, then we've rewilded. But just focus on the journey at this point in time. And this is what I always say to landowners that I'm advising. You are moving in a direction. And it'll be up to future generations to decide how far up that spectrum we end up. And, well, obviously I've mentioned that what we're doing through traditional conservation is not enough on its own. And, in my travels around, I visited thousands of sites around the country over the last 40 years or so. And, there are so many sites that are incredibly degraded by centuries of human activity, and none more so than plenty of our national parks, sadly. There are huge areas in our national parks which are very poor in biodiversity terms and not delivering anything like the capability in terms of ecosystem services. And there are, of course, some, fantastic hotspots within these sites, but nevertheless, the degree of wildness in our national parks, as you can see from Steve Carver's map, is, really low in this country. And then we have the issue around species, and particularly decline in abundance of biodiversity. And this is it's a snapshot of data from gamekeeper stats from an estate in Scotland over a 3-year period in the 1800s. And this just represents the animals that the keepers have killed in that period. And it tells you, it just shows you what an incredible pyramid base they must have had in terms of invertebrates and birds and small mammals, plants, etc., to support these figures, these numbers of predators, quite staggering numbers that were killed. And yes, the populations probably were starting to decline then, but there was still some left after all of this killing effort. So I'm not having a go at the historic gamekeeping here. What I'm using this slide to demonstrate is that, the biomass that would have underpinned the peak of this pyramid would have been incredible. The other thing that I will point out here is that the two entries at the bottom there, fox and magpie. Look how low those numbers are. Now, I am sure there's more to it than this, but nevertheless, it does show you that if you've got lots of these closer to apex predators in the ecosystem, then the chances are they are going to be managing the mesopredators, and there's a better balance. And as you know, now we've lost that balance because we've taken out, more or less wiped out, the top of the food chain, and so the mesopredators are in huge numbers in modern times. So we must not just be thinking about the diversity of wildlife, but the abundance as well. And we must remember that this is a spectrum that we need to move along if we are going to rewild. And this is a simple diagram that shows you management intensity from low to high in the vertical axis, and then project size along the horizontal axis. And most of our sites in this country, most of our conservation sites are kind of towards the top left, fairly managed and relatively small. Currently, most of the rewilding sites are in the bottom left-hand corner, and we need to be thinking about trying to move somewhere close to the middle of that graph. I'm not talking about the bottom right-hand corner, which could be virtually impossible in much of England and Wales, but just to move to the center of that graph with some of our sites would be a massive, massive step forward. These are the key principles that we will always remind landowners and partner organizations about. And right at the top, people are key. This is not about land abandonment and kicking people out. This is about engaging Homo sapiens as a species that belongs in the natural environment just as much as any other species, and trying to find ways of us being there, belonging there, being part of that ecosystem without significantly impacting on other elements of biodiversity, etc. Size matters, as I've already touched on. The bigger the scale you operate at, the more relaxed you're likely to be able to be about possibly losing some species from one part of an area, in the knowledge that if natural processes are prevailing, there is a strong possibility of these species appearing in other places. And that links to working with natural processes, allowing nature to prevail. The fourth one is relevant, particularly in this country, because we've got such a degraded baseline, as I've touched on already. So when I talk about marathon with sprint start, I'm really talking about the level of activity. You're in it for the long term. Certainly, this is a very long game that we're in here. But because we've got a biodiversity crisis and we've got a climate emergency, those words, crisis and emergency, mean that, we need to act. We can't just fiddle around tweaking here and there, waiting for things to happen in most cases. We need to intervene if we are going to kickstart this recovery in time. And so many projects, not all of them, but many projects are carrying out quite a lot of early intervention to kickstart that recovery. And I think that's entirely sensible. So that's what the Sprint Start is all about. But then the difference between a traditional conservation project and a rewilding project is that with a traditional conservation project, you might intervene a lot to start with. And to be honest, that will look very similar to a rewilding initiative. But then over time, with the traditional conservation project, you're going to continue to intervene to maintain your reed bed habitat or your lowland floodplain grassland, wildflower rich grassland, etc. You're going to continue to manage it. Whereas with a rewilding project, you will then start to tail off in terms of your input, in terms of your intervention. And that's where they differ. But in the early years, they can often look very same, and you'll hear people saying, "Oh, well, that's not rewilding. That's just nature-friendly farming or conservation." But remember, this is a journey, and the idea is that over time you then start to reduce your intervention. And Fit for the Future is, of course, all about future climate, future human population levels. How are we going to restore large-scale habitats in the face of these challenges? And I use this to remind people that it's not about harking back to some halcyon days in the past. We must certainly pay attention to what we once had and whether that would be suitable for restoration. you know, for example, when it comes to species reintroductions. But it's not about trying to recreate something from 1,000 or 2,000 years ago, because the goalposts have moved significantly. So yeah, it's about future resilience. Now, the question of how much rewilding, you know, regularly comes up, and you know, we at Rewilding Britain, we talk about 5% core rewilding as being a, you know, a very stretching, ambitious target, but a target that would turn things around in terms of biodiversity and climate mitigation. And I believe that that is correct. But it's not, you know, on its own, that's not going to work either. You know, just like traditional conservation on its own, it hasn't delivered the recovery of nature that we were seeking. So we need to bear in mind that this would need to sit within a much wider landscape of nature-friendly farming and nature reserve management, etc., nature-friendly land uses, if you like, and marine uses. We're not, you know, the sea is equally important here. So these are the this is how we, how at Rewilding Britain, we would talk about achieving 30 by 30. 5% core rewilding, 25% nature-friendly land uses, buffering it and connecting it, etc. Now, I'll run this a couple of times. This is basically a series of Google Earth shots of the field at the Knepp estate. And you know, what does rewilding look like is, you know, a perennial question. You know, landowners want to know what it would look like for them. Every site is different, but one can give examples. And this is for much of, say, the warm, productive southeast of England, in areas where you have, as in this case, former arable fields with hedgerows, with, you know, extensive thorny scrub, blackthorn, hawthorn, buckthorn, dog rose, bramble, oak trees, as in this case. There's plenty of seed and fruit material to colonize bare ground, and that's exactly what's happened here with at Knepp, where they've allowed ceased cropping these fields, kept animals out for some years, and then eventually allowed, I think after about 8 years, allowed animals into this particular area, broken up land drains so water sits in the land for longer. And this is the transformation that you see in the space of 15 years. Very quickly, scrub appears out in these fields, often carried by jays and squirrels, and fruits excreted by birds, etc. Water sitting in the land, and I'll just play it one more time. And you'll also see turbidity starting to appear in the water as animals are let into that landscape and starting to churn things up, Tamworth pigs, etc. And I'll come on to the use of these animals in a minute. So quite a dramatic transformation. If you've visited Knepp, which I'm sure many have, you will see also that there are still some areas of permanent grassland interspersed amongst all of this. And it's fascinating to see how these mosaics have developed. Now, one of the key ambitions I had when I joined Rewilding Britain 6 years ago was to establish a rewilding network. I was involved in helping to set up the river restoration network a long time ago, probably 25 or 30 years ago, which became the River Restoration Centre. And that organisation has done a brilliant job of helping to promote good practice in river restoration around the country, and bring people together and share experiences, and opportunities, and challenges and failures. Indeed, failures very important to share. And we've set up a rewilding network, and it seems to be going from strength to strength. We now have 20 county scale networks, local networks, if you like, feeding into our national network, and we have over 70 member projects which are over 250 acres, over 100 hectares in size, many of them a lot bigger than that. And we have a running total of what we'd call rewilding, land in rewilding. Now, as I said earlier, I cover England and Wales, so I'm speaking predominantly about English sites, in fact, today. But there are lots of much bigger sites in Scotland that are not yet on this network, simply because we haven't yet gathered the data and information from them. with this network of sites, all of which I visited across England, we now have 50 sites worth of good data. Now the stats we're currently updating the data from these 50 sites right now. I'm literally chasing up a few now to get information from them for an annual review of that information. So most of the stats I'm giving you here today are from a year ago, but things are largely the same, apart from one which I will flag later. But most of this data, the percentages, etc., are pretty similar a year on. And the first thing to say is that, you know, if you split them up by land ownership, you might think, if you to believe what you read in the media, you might think that it's all rich private estates that are doing this. Actually, that's not the case at all. It's about a quarter of the land holdings by area that are in private estate ownership, and that is almost exactly proportionate to the proportion of rural areas in England that are in private estate ownership. So it's proportionate. What we should be seeing here is the government agency figures and the water company figures, particularly at a much higher percentage, and that's an area where I and others need to be strategically targeting the likes of the MOD, the Crown Estate, the Forestry Commission. There's so much scope for them to be doing so much more. So that's work in progress. But that's how the ownership currently breaks down. Then we have the issue around herbivores. You know, many of you will know, we're missing, you know, the large herbivores that we once had. They're either extinct or completely extinct or absent from the country. And so virtually all rewilding landowners are using proxies for those. And you'll be very familiar with, you know, the story of places like Knepp and no doubt Haweswater and Ken Hill, etc. nowadays. So these are very important. And actually, when you look at the data of livestock units before and after rewilding, the facts are that actually cattle numbers have gone up slightly. If you take all the sites together, cattle numbers have increased, so have pigs and ponies, and it's the sheep, inevitably the sheep, that have taken the big hit, because as you all know, sheep are significantly suppressing botanical diversity and having impact on soils and permeability, etc. So there's a lot of mythology around food production, and you often see this kind of, oh, how are we going to feed the world, you know, if we rewild everywhere? Well, first of all, it's not our job to feed the world, and secondly, no one's suggesting rewild everywhere. The current percentage is probably around 1% of the country in rewilding at the moment. 1%. 70% of the country is farmed, and there is no way that we couldn't achieve that 5% comfortably in this country if we wanted to, and we wouldn't have an impact on food production. We know that, you know, from Henry Dimbleby's food strategy, 20% of the farmland in this country produces 3% of the calorific need. So there's plenty of farmland out there that could be rewilded that is non-productive or marginally productive. And of course, there's lots of other land as well, woodland and grouse moor, etc. And then the other important points are that if we're really serious about food security, we should be looking at, you know, food waste, for example. We waste 40% of the food we produce, which is ridiculous. So food waste, pricing, distribution, those are all the key priority areas. You know, we could easily do this without impacting on productive farmland. And Rewilding Britain is currently in the process of mapping all of this to demonstrate clearly that can happen, and to demonstrate where it can happen. People will say, oh, you can't rewild where you've got triple SIs. Well, actually, you can, because over a third of the rewilding areas are designated triple SI. It's entirely possible through negotiation with Natural England. And you don't give up on the jewels in the crown. So 2% of the overall sites, 2% by area, is still in conservation management. You don't want to lose the really special bits of a site. So common sense says you carry on managing them for the time being, and maybe at a later date you can make a decision about relaxing on that. I'm going to rattle through this. Lots of interventions, as I talked about, early intervention, sprint start to the marathon. And so there's all sorts of different interventions going on. These are the most popular ones here. And reintroducing native species, which is the one that people tend to equate with rewilding. Actually, that's just one of 25 different interventions. And obviously topical, because as I say, I was giving evidence to the Parliamentary Committee, EFRA Committee this week. Very topical. These are interventions which are now, reintroductions which are now underway and happening and going very well actually so far. We're abiding by our UCN guidance as we should, and that was a key point that I made at the EFRA hearing. And my view is that it's a culture shift we need in this country. And I summarized it by saying we need to move from a no why kind of attitude towards species reintroductions to a yes if. Yes, if you can demonstrate that you are following IUCN guidelines properly and thoroughly, then we should be looking at the positives, and all of the questioning in that EFRA inquiry was based on bad things, on negative things. What about the impacts? What about compensation? What if you're going to do? What are you going to do if this goes wrong? And actually, as I kept reminding them, for every impact, there are many more potential benefits and opportunities that might come from many of these species of introduction. So we need to be looking at the whole picture when one's carrying out impact assessment, impacts positive and negative. And the other thing to say is that there needs to be a tiered system, because most species reintroductions that we've got logged on our system are actually very innocuous species of butterflies, lower plants, birds, etc., reptiles, amphibians, with very little significant impact. So there needs to be a tiered system in terms of assessment. And I'll scuttle through this, but as you can see at the bottom there, beaver, by far the most popular, being considered by many of these sites, followed by likes of water vole, stork, pine marten. Just a little bit on economics. So this is very important, and it's the sort of thing that government wants to know about and wants to hear. So we are seeing a significant increase in income sources post rewilding, and it's because rewilding often enables diversification of income. And here are a range of examples from around the country. And here I've summarized the big changes in terms of income sources for these projects. So so you will see, for example, so what I've done here is I've listed out of what was at the time 43 sites which I had data for. I've listed those projects which were accessing these different types of funding listed here before rewilding. So you can see them in order: basic payment scheme and stewardship were top of the list. And then during rewilding, those in red are where there's significantly fewer projects accessing that funding, and those in green are where there are significantly more projects accessing the funding. And you can see straight away that this diversification that I refer to is well represented down in the bottom right hand corner there, with camping, glamping, education, tourism. These are new opportunities that are appearing for finance on these sites, and this means they're putting their eggs in many more than one basket, several baskets, whereas previously it was probably just, say, basic payment scheme and lamb, sheep lamb production. Now they're going into a range: stewardship and beef and camping and nature tourism, etc. Okay, my system is frozen. Apologies, folks, but I'm unable to scroll forward. So I'll carry on talking, but I haven't got. Looks like my slides are not going to show. So that I'll move quickly on to jobs, because this is the stat that is improving all the time. And we now have a situation where last year there was 65% increase in jobs, and this comes from this diversification that I referred to. Now I'm halfway through gathering the data from the projects again this year, and there are more projects in the list now. We're up to 50 sites worth, but the figure is at 80% now. 80% increase in full-time equivalent jobs. And I can talk later if there's time about what sorts of jobs those are. But it's quite clear that this is helping to deliver jobs in rural communities, particularly where they are very much needed. There was also at least a 10-fold increase in volunteer engagement. Other benefits that accrue are, for example, those from ecosystem services. So restoring peat bog, planting trees on upland slopes, which were formerly wooded, slowing the flow down the catchment, improving water quality, storing more carbon, etc., etc. There's good data emerging from many projects, and I have a series of killer facts which are pulled together, which show good peer-reviewed evidence of these benefits. The biodiversity benefits are well known. We know all about that through NEP, for example, with turtle doves and purple emperors, and even large tortoiseshell butterfly now, nightingales, brown hair streak, etc. Many projects are gathering data now for their own sites. And what Rewilding Britain is aiming to do is to start to pull that together into a single monitoring resource, a bit like, again, the River Restoration Centre have done. So that's work in progress. Watch this space, but it's going to be a hugely valuable resource, not only for people to learn about successes and achievements, but again, to learn about complications. We will hear from other experts today that no doubt that it's not always, rewilding is not always going to deliver major biodiversity benefits. There will be some losers as well as plenty of winners. And I'll finish with the funding opportunities. The main policy opportunity by some distance is the Environmental Land Management Scheme, which is the Future Farming Scheme. Now we have been working with DEFRA for some time on this, and I'm sure there are plenty of people on this call who may be also connected with discussions with DEFRA on the future of farming. It is very much work in progress, and we're waiting for the detail. The devil will be in the detail. Now, we do have the landscape recovery component of ELM, which is the ideal place to deliver large-scale landscape scale land use change, some of which could be rewilding. That's good. The DEFRA has talked about rewilding being in there in the past. For example, George Eustace was citing the word, which is a big step forward. But if that tier of the scheme is not properly funded, then we won't see much significant change. So it is all very much about levels of funding in the different components of ELM, and we and others are arguing that it should be a three-way split between the sustainable farming incentive, the stewardship plus, I think it's called now, the mid-tier, and this landscape scale land use change, landscape recovery. It should be a three-way split, an equal three-way split. And if that happened, then I think we will make significant progress towards biodiversity recovery. If it doesn't, if it's nothing like that, and if it's, as the NFU are suggesting, that at least 2/3 should be in sustainable farming incentive, then I fear that's almost going to be business as usual. There are many other funding opportunities which I haven't got time to talk about, not least philanthropic funding, by the way, which is quite significant now. But it is all moving slowly in the right direction. And the key thing for people like myself now is to try and stop it moving slowly in the right direction and engender a step change. So I'll stop there, folks.
James Bullock, could we be more ambitious about the land take for rewilding, given the terrible state of nature in the UK? The Dimbleby report suggested 30% of UK farmland could be released if we reduce food waste, meat eating, etc.
Yeah, absolutely, James. we certainly could. And I just want to say a little bit more about the 5% and the 25% that I mentioned earlier. So when I talk about 5%, I mean 5% core rewilding, a long way up that spectrum. In fact, as high up the spectrum as we could possibly get. That means, wildcat, golden eagle, white-tailed eagle, maybe lynx in the right places, beavers, etc. And virtually nothing happening, nature taking care of itself, or as close to as you could possibly get. So that's what I mean by 5% core rewilding. And actually, the other 25% that I talked about, nature-friendly land uses, that's more or less like the rewilding that I showed you the examples of. So, we are, Rewilding Britain is gradually formulating its messaging around this. It's again work in progress, and it's linked to the mapping I mentioned, because we need to be able to demonstrate that we can do this without significant impact, particularly on food production. But so watch this space. Hopefully later this year there will be we will be producing messages and even maybe a short report on how we think this is doable.
Okay. Deepani Jayantha, in the definition you said, to the point where nature is allowed to take care of itself. What exactly is that? What sort of climax vegetation you would expect?
Well, that depends where you are, I'm afraid. Obviously depends on the nature of soils, geology, climate, etc. But just to give you a very crude summary of what I would expect, certainly you would expect much more in the way of tree and scrub growth in the landscape, but not, I don't subscribe to the view that this country was blanketed with forest. I do support the opinion that it was a mosaic of habitats, obviously with a lot more trees and scrub than we have now. So I would expect it to be a much more treed landscape, and that includes in the uplands, where it'd be certainly a much scrubbier landscape, with moorland and heathy shrub vegetation, but with open areas of grassland. I've always felt, we wouldn't have these wildflower-rich areas if we hadn't had those areas of grassland originally. So yes, a mosaic, but a much greater proportion of woody vegetation.
I think we're
Mike Gillard, what's the biggest obstacle to getting more wild piggery, like Tamworths, Oxford Sandy and Blacks? Seems their rootling activity is a big missing tool in our landscapes that would create the disturbance needed to unlock static landscapes.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm not an expert on livestock. I need to get that excuse in early, but interesting, this came, pigs came up, of course, at the EFRA inquiry. I was sat next to the Deputy President of the National Farmers Union, and of course they're very worried about swine flu coming into this country, and the presence of wild boar obviously excites the farming community. So in terms of domestic, so wild boar, getting wild boar back where they belong will be a major challenge because of those kind of concerns. In terms of supplies of rare breed pigs, I'm afraid I don't know the answer, because I don't know enough about it, but I will just say this, just in case anyone on the call is interested. I just had an email, and this is where the network's starting to really come into its own, little things like this, where somebody contacted me and said, oh, I've got some Iron Age pigs that somebody can have for nothing if they want them, and so we put that on the network members forum, because there's also like a marketplace where, so if you are actually personally interested in getting pigs, then please do keep an eye on that.
Okay. Rupert Maysfield, interested in what rewilding in the marine environment might look like. Presumably regulation and restriction of fisheries activities would be a significant part of any marine rewilding areas. Could East Anglia's extensive offshore wind farms become marine rewilding areas in the future? Is marine rewilding something Rewilding UK is looking at?
Okay, so yeah, I didn't do it justice in my talk, the marine environment, and certainly for it to be true rewilding in a marine environment, that means no take. We've got to be honest and straight about this. That means no impacts whatsoever. And of course there are one or two sites now around the country which are doing this, and we know from both from some of those sites in the early days and indeed from other parts of the world, that if you do ensure complete, genuine no-take zones and no impact zones, that can massively benefit not only the ecosystem within those zones, but also outside of it, including fishing interests outside of those zones. So really, it is a no-brainer for us to be establishing those kind of sites around our offshore around our coast. And yes, I know Chris Baines quite well, and Chris is a keen promoter of the idea of using offshore turbine constructions to create artificial reefs. And that seems like an obvious thing to be doing. If we've got to have these turbines, why not make the most of them and try and design their footing structures in a way that generates replacement habitat.
Okay.
Joan Hardingham, your figures show more people are being encouraged into the countryside, as has COVID. There is also increasing pressure for the right to roam. How can this be reconciled with habitat disturbance from people and dogs, particularly ponds and nesting habitat?
Yes, okay, interesting. So there's a couple of things there. First of all, if you look at the problems, the biggest problem we face in this area is detachment from nature. Okay, we have lost contact with nature. We don't understand it. A lot of people are scared of it. So the first thing to say is we've got to try and get more people back into the countryside so that there's a greater understanding and appreciation and valuing of nature. So I don't have a problem with encouraging people to these places. However, yes, of course, there is a risk that there will be damage done to, rare ground nesting birds or rare habitats, etc. And we have to do that through continual education. But we can't educate people properly if we exclude them. We have to include them and educate them in parallel. And we will still always have problems, but those problems are, in my view, insignificant compared with the problem we face in the bigger picture, which is this continual further detachment from nature. When it comes to ponds, actually, there are some situations where you wouldn't want dogs in ponds, but the nature reserve I touched on right at the beginning that I created in my village, I designed it so that dogs could plow into the pond, and it still supports great crested newts. It still supports 22 species of dragonfly. So I'm very happy that there is a balance that can be struck in the vast majority of situations.
Okay.
Juliet Hawkins, does Alastair think the various unknowns, e.g. inheritance tax changes with wild land, and a plethora of possible future options to fund BNG, woodland carbon credits, elms, etc. are paralysing landowners at present from making a decision to go for rewilding?
They are definitely slowing things down. Now it's not stopping lots of people. And by the way, the inheritance tax issue is something that I and others are and people in DEFRA are working on with Treasury at the moment. It would be ridiculous if the government was to create a farming scheme which incentivized people not to plaster the upland countryside, for example, with lots of sheep. They're paying them not to do that. It would be ridiculous to then penalize them by removing their inheritance tax exemption. So fingers crossed, common sense will prevail on that one. But, there's lots of people working on that at the moment. There are no examples yet where somebody's fallen foul of it, by the way. So far, so good. When it comes to all these other initiatives, biodiversity offsetting, biodiversity net gain, nutrient offsetting, yeah, people are waiting to see, carbon, for example. I don't advise people on these kind of offsetting schemes because I don't know enough about them, but they are fraught with challenges, and that is causing people to hold off a bit. But I think we're going to see quite significant change in the next 2 or 3 years. A lot of these schemes are going to become much more formalized.